They were never meant to hold the line alone. They weren't the biggest, or the strongest, or the most experienced. They were just another U.S. unit in a war far too large for any single group to change. And yet, against every expectation, every number, every rule of war, this one unit did change everything. They turned a collapse into a stand, a disaster into a breakthrough, a moment of defeat into the turning point of an entire front. This is the story of how a single American unit, outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly forgotten, shifted the course of World War II. It began in the winter of 1944, when the war in Europe hung by a thread. The Allies believed Germany was finished. Berlin was bombing rubble. Fuel was scarce. The Reich was dying. But Hitler had planned a final strike, a desperate gamble meant to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force the West into a negotiated peace. It would hit the weakest spot on the front. Thin American lines stretched across the Ardennes, guarded by units resting, refitting, and unprepared. And at the center of that storm stood the unit no one expected would matter. Young, under strength, short on supplies, barely familiar with the frozen landscape around them. When the first German shells landed, the forest didn't shake, it screamed. Artillery tore apart trees and earth. Communications lines snapped instantly. Fog and snow choked the sky. And from behind that wall of smoke came something few Americans had ever seen. Masses of German armor, panthers, tigers, half-tracks rolling forward like a dark flood. Entire U.S. positions broke in minutes. Convoys abandoned their vehicles and ran. Isolated platoons fought until they were swallowed whole. But somehow, somewhere amid the collapse, this one single unit refused to move. Their radios crackled with warnings. Enemy armor approaching. Retreat positions compromised. Fall back now. They didn't fall back. They dug into the frozen ground until their fingers bled. They positioned every rifle, every grenade, every anti-tank weapon they had. Some hadn't slept in 30 hours. Some had no winter clothing. But something held them there, something stubborn, reckless, impossibly brave. When the first German tanks broke through the tree line, the Americans looked impossibly small. But they fought anyway. Bazooka teams crawled through snow and fired at point-blank range. Machine gunners clung to their positions even as shells burst yards away. Infantrymen shifted foxhole to foxhole, buying seconds, then minutes, just enough to slow the German advance. And those minutes changed everything, because the Germans weren't expecting resistance here. Their timetable depended on speed, break the line, pour armor through, and keep moving west before the Allies could react. But this one American unit forced them to stop, to regroup, to reposition tanks, to send infantry hunting for snipers and machine gun nests that shouldn't have existed. Hours passed. The fog lifted. Allied planes returned to the sky. Artillery reinforcements zeroed in. Fresh divisions began to arrive. The German advance, once unstoppable, was suddenly choking on the delay. One officer later admitted, "We were supposed to be miles ahead by noon. We were still fighting at the starting line." What the Germans didn't know was that the unit they were battling wasn't a reinforced regiment. It wasn't mechanized infantry. It wasn't elite paratroopers. It was a small American formation, cut off from both flanks, firing the last of their ammunition, surviving on sheer will and still holding. When their lines finally broke, the Germans surged forward, only to discover the real danger. Behind that single unit, the Allies had rebuilt an entirely new defensive front. Artillery, armor, infantry, all waiting because one group of men had bought them the time to arrive. The tide didn't turn because of strategy, or numbers, or technology. It turned because a unit too small to matter chose to matter. When the battle finally ended, the snow was black with smoke and scarred with tracks and craters. The unit that held the line suffered heavy losses, too many for a group that size. But they did what entire battalions had failed to do. They stopped a breakthrough that could have torn the Allied armies apart. They stalled a German offensive that might have changed the outcome of the war in the West. They turned a disaster into the counterattack that ultimately shattered Hitler's final gamble. And the strangest part? Most people today don't even know their name. They were not Hollywood heroes. They weren't in the textbooks. They didn't get monuments or movies. They simply fought until the world around them could stand again. This is how a single U.S. unit turned the tide. Not with overwhelming firepower, not with superior equipment, but with the one thing war can never fully measure: The moment ordinary soldiers decide they will not move. Their stand didn't just slow the Germans. It saved the Allied front. It saved the offensive. And it helped save a continent. History remembers big armies, famous generals, and decisive battles. But sometimes, the war shifts because a small unit, trapped in the snow, running out of ammunition, looks at an impossible enemy and refuses to take a single step back.